Hi, I'm Nick Davey, your iFit guide, and today, in our episode of this Zimbabwe series, we are visiting an ancient civilization, a lost city of stone in the remote heart of southern Africa, that between 600 and 900 years ago was as rich, powerful, and influential in this region as Alexandria was in ancient Egypt and Constantinople was in the Byzantine Empire. So go ahead and get warmed up in your machine. Let's get those legs moving because this is going to be a fascinating journey. It's a drizzly, cloudy kind of a day, which sort of feels appropriate for this kind of adventure. And in a moment, you're going to feel your machine incline. We're going to start this walk with a bit of a hill to get you warmed up fast. And here we go. Up we go. So we began this series with a visit to Victoria Falls on the Zambezi River. We learned about the British colonization of Rhodesia and the war for liberation from white minority rule. But what we have not yet heard is the story of pre-colonial Zimbabwe, the history of the people who lived here before the arrival of Europeans. And so today we're going to learn about the Shona people, the majority ethnic group of the country, and specifically about their early ancestors who built this incredible stone city known as Great Zimbabwe. You can probably hear me getting a bit puffed. This is quite a steep hill, and I hope your legs are getting a good workout and you're getting warmed up. Now, this story actually contains a great and tragic irony at its heart. For while this site is sacred ground, a unifying symbol of cultural and historical pride for the Shona people and Zimbabweans in general, it was partly the fevered rumors of its existence. Fantastical stories of a great stone palace deep in the jungle, and later factual evidence of just such a palace that drove fortune seekers, treasure hunters, and explorers to colonize this land in the first place. Let's head up here. It's getting a little bit steeper. You're going to be feeling that in your calves and glutes, I'm sure. Now, when Zimbabwe changed its name from Rhodesia at independence in 1980, it became the only country in the world named after an archaeological site. And that site is what we will see around us today. These stone ruins up ahead are one of the most dramatic architectural landscapes in sub-Saharan Africa. And outside of the pyramids of Egypt, the largest pre-modern stone complex on the African continent. Now, the main walled site that we're going to see is about 50 acres in size. But that was just where the royalty and the wealthy elite lived. The wider city of Great Zimbabwe extended beyond the walls to take in a beautiful lake in the distance, which we'll soon see. And while at the height of its power in the 14th and 15th century, the empire of Great Zimbabwe, which was the trading, military, political, and economic powerhouse of southern Africa, covered an area of more than 40,000 square miles, an area about the size of England. Now, the city arose at a crossroads between east and west, north and south trade routes that existed at that time, and with access to a complex river system. The people of Great Zimbabwe not only had fertile lands and access to gold, ivory, and iron, they had a transport network. Pardon me, I'm just slipping on this big boulder. And that transport network allowed them to ship goods overland or down those rivers to the booming Muslim-run markets of the East African coast and beyond. Just head up this way. As with any empire, the richer that empire became, the more powerful they got from trade, the bigger and more elaborate the homes and palaces of the elite who ran the system actually became. Hence, this place, Great Zimbabwe. The path I'm on is called the Ancient Ascent, and it leads up to what is called the hill complex. Up there, atop this mountain, is where the king lived. And as you'll soon see, his home and his throne gave him a commanding view of his empire. In ancient times, the areas to the left and right of me were covered with terraces, and on those terraces were homes, clay huts, which housed the king's relatives and advisors. And anybody who wanted an audience with the king first had to consult and negotiate with the people who lived on the terraces. And if they were granted permission for an audience with the king, they moved up this way and very quickly encountered this area. Here, we have these huge natural granite boulders on either side of the path, and the path becomes so narrow, only one person can get through at a time. This section is called the Blood Passage. And if the king was being attacked, his men could easily block the pathway with a boulder or roll rocks down from above onto the heads of the enemy down here below. Now, assuming the visitor didn't get his head caved in, they'd continue up this way and approach the royal enclosure. So here we go. Steep and it's slippery today, but the view will be well worth it from the top. Now look at this magnificent stone wall. Come up here and we'll get a little closer. As I said, we're approaching the royal enclosure. Now these bricks, these stones, are all handmade, interlocked, quarried stones. No mortar, no cement. The pieces fit together almost like Lego. And it's a testament really to the craftsmanship of the men and women who built this place, that 7 centuries after the first stones were laid, this is as solid as ever. Almost perfectly intact and just the way it looked when it was first built. Now this is the entrance to the royal enclosure, and you can see that the doorway was built deliberately low to ensure that everybody who approached the king bowed as they entered. In we go. Welcome to Great Zimbabwe, the House of Stone. Just take a moment to admire these incredible walls built 7 centuries ago. And if you come this way, I'll give you a peek at that commanding view that the king had from up here. Look at this. Look at this. I'm just going to pause here for a moment. I'll slow your machine down so you can catch your breath and hydrate. Now, there are basically 3 parts to Great Zimbabwe. I'm standing inside the hill complex, which was completed in around 1150 AD. It's the oldest part of the city. This area contains the king's residence and enclosures that were used for judicial, spiritual, and sacred purposes. Now, below us, to the west down there, that huge walled structure we can see directly into is called the Great Enclosure. It functioned as a site for surplus population as the city grew. It was also the Queen's residence. Now, one plausible reason we can see into it from up here is that the king needed to know who was having an audience with the Queen. The third element is down that way. It's called the Valley Complex, and it's on the lower ground between here and the Great Enclosure. It was built in 1250, and it was a booming marketplace, residential area, and treasure vault. Let's keep going up here. Now, archaeologists have excavated Chinese porcelain from this area, glass beads from Southeast Asia, candlestick holders from the Middle East, ocean coral, and copper ingots from trading centers along the Zambezi River and from Central Africa. These discoveries led to all sorts of controversy about the origins of Great Zimbabwe. In white-ruled Rhodesia, for example, when I was a boy, history books declared that Great Zimbabwe could not possibly have been built by Africans, by indigenous people. It must have been built by Greeks or Phoenicians, Arabs or Chinese, just not Africans. Absolute nonsense, of course. Now, if we head up this way, we're going to enter the Eastern Enclosure. So come and look at this. I find this area just stunning. Look at how the King's Palace is built around these towering boulders. We are on hallowed ground here. This was a spiritual place for the Shona people and those early kings. And you can really feel it. It has an unmistakable aura. There's something sort of otherworldly and mysterious about it. The rocks, the overhanging trees, the valley below, the glimpses of the sky above, eagles circling up there. You can imagine a king communing with the spirits here. If you follow me up this way, I've got something pretty wild to show you. Just through here, we have an area that's called the Sacred Enclosure. This was the spiritual heart of the kingdom, the cathedral in the middle of town, if you will. Now, something took place in this very enclosure about 120 years ago that helped change the course of this country's history, and some might say cursed it, in the same way that the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb was said to have cursed that infamous expedition in Egypt. And the story goes like this. The national symbol of Zimbabwe, seen on its flag, on its currency, and on the shirt of the national cricket team, is the Zimbabwe bird. It's a depiction of a bird of prey, either a battler eagle or a fish eagle. And in Shona culture, eagles are hailed as birds of heaven. And legend has it that those with the power to harness an eagle, a king, for example, could control lightning, thunder, and rain. Well, that national bird symbol comes from this enclosure, from right here at Great Zimbabwe. A series of 8 birds carved out of soapstone and said to represent the 8 most prominent kings that ruled for the entire duration of the empire were found here, carved into these walls, in this enclosure facing east. Now, here in my pocket, I've got a tiny replica of those Zimbabwe birds. The originals were each 5 feet tall, and you see this symbol everywhere in Zimbabwe today. It's kind of the symbolic equivalent of the bald eagle in the United States. It holds an enormous amount of symbolic power for the people in this area. Now, as I mentioned before, this was the spiritual hub of the kingdom. The king's subjects would attend sacred ceremonies here and sit atop stone benches, and they would listen to a disembodied voice that came from the rocks up here. Now, as we climb, you're going to feel your machine start to incline in just a moment. And that disembodied voice came from a spirit medium called the Mahandoro, and we'll learn more about him up the top. Follow me. So the Mondoro, or high priest, would ascend this narrow, slippery path, pass up through here, curve around the back of this giant boulder. And then if you follow me up here, I'll show you something interesting. Once the Mondoro reached this platform, he would hide behind a stone wall. And these are the last remnants of the stone wall that at one point continued all the way across this ledge. The Mondoro was a spirit medium, which means that he was an intermediary between heaven and earth. It was his job to convey messages from the gods to the people, and they would possess his body. But when the spirits were angry, they would possess his body and force him to tear off all of his clothes, and he would scream and shout in tongues, which must have been absolutely terrifying for the people who were listening from down below. The wall that was here, of course, preserved his modesty. Let's keep going down. So the king was living up here, and in the open land down below us, stretching to shimmering Lake Muturikwi, those were effectively the suburbs. Now, how many people lived here and outside the walls of the site? Well, estimates vary, but probably at the height of the kingdom's power, as many as 20,000 people. And how would the king communicate with them? Well, come and take a look at this. This is a cave, or rather, a rock shelter lined with ironstone cobbles. If you want to see how an early form of radio or Wi-Fi worked back then, the king would shout into the cave, and the sound of his voice would bounce out across the valley and could be heard for miles, apparently. I'll give you a demonstration. Keep walking on your machines! There you go. That's better than the cell phone reception I get at my home in Istanbul at times. Now, it's said that the king would often call down the name of one of his 200 wives and summon one of them up here to the royal enclosure to cook for him and to spend the night. Okay, so let's head down the mountain and check out where the king's wives and his queen lived. By the way, this is called the Watergate Path. Every day, women would carry earthen pots down to the bottom of the mountain, fill those pots up with water from a stream, and then haul it all the way back up here for the king. Talk about a good workout. How are you holding up? I hope you're feeling good and strong. Now, picture the scene 700 or 800 years ago. Great Zimbabwe at its zenith. 20,000 people are living here and just beyond the walls of the city, and they're thriving. They grow crops and raise cattle. They mine for gold on the lakeshore and beyond. They were getting 25 tons of gold per year from this region, and it's going down river and overland to the booming Muslim-run markets of the East African coast, today's Mozambique and Tanzania. And from there, it's shipped to the Middle East, India, China, and Europe, all part of the Great Indian Ocean Trade Network. Great Zimbabwe exported at least 400 to 500 tons of gold in its 300-year lifespan. And that gold went around the world and fueled other global economies and currencies. There's a lot of research going on now in Asia and parts of Europe that proves that gold from right here and found in antique jewelry in India and France comes from Great Zimbabwe. Meanwhile, in exchange, traders are returning with luxuries for Great Zimbabwe: perfumes, spices, seashells, coral, glass beads, Chinese pottery, cloth, fabric, candlestick holders, jewelry. We talk about globalism today. This was globalism in the Middle Ages, and Great Zimbabwe was a big player in it. And consider what was happening in Europe as Great Zimbabwe is flourishing. In 1337, the 100 Years' War begins between France and England. And from 1347, the Black Death, one of the largest pandemics in human history, sweeps through Europe, killing 25 million people. And here, life is good. Life is very good. So take a look at these structures over here. These are the remnants of the enclosures in which the king's middle-ranking wives lived. His first wife, the queen, lived in the great enclosure up there, which we'll soon see. And further down that way, near to the base of the mountain, close to the king, lived his newest, youngest wives. The king, as I mentioned, had up to 200 wives, and they were passed on to the successor king when he died. Apparently, the women also used the leaves and the extracts from the leaves of these unusual kind of Dr. Seuss-like plants for medicinal purposes, and also as lotions for their skin. As we come up to this little vantage point up here, you can get a better look at those aloe plants. And you can also see that's the mountain where we just were, and the royal enclosure is right at the top. And from here, you can really get a sense of the power and the authority that he projected from up there. It's kind of intimidating, really, to know that the king or one of his senior people could be keeping an eye on you at any given time. Now let's head up this little slope, and we're going to go and see where the queen bee herself lived. Again, very narrow pathway to get access, ensuring that only one person at a time could approach the queen. So by 1450, this was built. This is the Great Enclosure, the largest stone-built structure in Africa other than the pyramids. This wall is incredible. Over 30 feet high, the stone is granite, and there are more than 1 million bricks in these walls. It would have taken decades to build. And as we step inside the eastern entrance, we come to the Queen's Enclosure. This was the home of the king's first and most important wife. There were 2 huts in here, one for sleeping and one over here for cooking. And among the Queen's many duties was supervising the education of young men and women as they prepared for marriage. Young men were sent out and tested. They had to kill a wild animal. They learned to plow, to mine, to smelt metals like iron ore and gold. The young women were tutored in domestic affairs, cooking, pottery, and most importantly, the rules of the palace, the do's and don'ts of dealing with the king. And if we head out through this gateway, I'm going to show you something really interesting. We'll sneak around this corner over here. Now, when the young men and women had completed their training, a young bull would be sacrificed on this altar and burned on a fire. If the smoke rose straight and true, it meant the gods were happy. But if not, if the smoke curled and blew away, then the gods were unsatisfied, and the youngsters had to continue their training. And if you come down this way, you'll see something that's also rather fascinating. If you look down here, you'll see that this is the exterior wall, the huge exterior wall we passed a moment ago, but just inside it, there is a second wall, an interior wall, a parallel passage, almost as high, mirroring the exterior wall, creating this narrow passage. Now, this wasn't for defense, as you might think, but rather for ritual purposes. During periods of initiation, young men would be led down this pathway, down the outer passage, and young women were led down the inner passage. Come down this way, it's going to get a little bit claustrophobic. This is, in fact, one of my favorite parts of Great Zimbabwe. It really feels like you're entering a labyrinth from which you might never return. And of course, as always, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. And when the young male initiates reached this iconic conical tower, they underwent circumcision. This tower is solid, it's not hollow, and it represents fertility, the harvest, and of course, its shape is clearly phallic. Come up this way. The young female initiates entered this area through their passage. And in here, they were taught through song and dance and some fairly graphic demonstrations about the act of conception and childbirth. And all of that happened in this large enclosure. Now, these, of course, were sacred ceremonies, but there's also evidence that this area was used for the smelting of gold and the making of jewelry. It would have been an incredibly important and busy place. Let's head. Stop anyway involves a sudden disruption of those long-established trade routes on the East Coast. So what might have happened in the late 1400s and 1500s to cause that? Well, consider, in 1497, en route to India, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, the first European to do so. Da Gama began trading on the East African coast, the start of Portuguese colonization of what is today's Mozambique. Now, where do the rivers Great Zimbabwe relies on flow to? Mozambique. The Portuguese poured into Africa and fought wars with the established African and Arab traders who ran the markets on the coast and disrupted that trade. We think we have trade wars today. Well, they existed in Africa 500 years ago. And so this combination, climate change, overpopulation, and the sudden disruption of what had been prosperous trade routes for centuries, likely all combined and contributed to the decline and fall of Great Zimbabwe, the Rome of Southern Africa. You've done really well. We're nearly finished, and it's time to start warming down, and I'm going to wrap this story up. Now, the empire may have collapsed, and this site become overgrown, covered in jungle and abandoned. But the stories and legends of Great Zimbabwe took on a life of their own, and they soon reached Europe. Some claimed this was the biblical land of Ophir, and that the ruins were in fact a replica of Israeli King Solomon's temple. Those stories fired up imaginations. Before long, other stories were being told about this being the palace of the Queen of Sheba and King Solomon's mines. Indeed, the Victorian adventure writer H. Rider Haggard's novels, King Solomon's Mines and Allan Quatermain, were inspired by the ruins, and in turn inspired an entire lost world literary genre, including inspiration for that Hollywood legend, Indiana Jones. And so here we are, back in the present, almost 1,000 years on from the first stone brick being planted in the first wall at this magnificent site. And you've made it to the end of the walk. Congratulations. It's been a real pleasure to show you around this remote and beautiful place. I'm Nick Davey, your iFit guide, and I can't wait to take you on another walk through this magical country.